In traditional corporate finance, evaluating when a company changes hands is relatively straightforward. We look for a discrete legal moment, usually a Hart-Scott-Rodino filing or the final closing date of a merger. That wall marks exactly when control transfers. But in frontier technology, that hard legal boundary dissolves. Control doesn't wait for a closing date. Instead, market influence bleeds across corporate lines continuously, long before any formal paperwork is signed. We recently saw the highest-profile example of this ambiguity regarding structural corporate control in the legal dispute between Elon Musk and OpenAI. Media coverage largely evaluated the lawsuit as a battle over corporate mission drift or internal governance policies. In May 2026, a federal jury at the U.S. courthouse in Oakland dismissed Musk's lawsuit after less than 2 hours of deliberation, ruling entirely on procedural statute of limitations grounds. Because the dismissal was procedural, the substantive merits of the case remain completely untested in court. We still lack a legal ruling on whether executives unjustly enriched themselves by structurally shifting control away from the original nonprofit mission. Underneath that specific litigation lies a much broader economic issue. Federal regulators evaluate corporate capture by tracking specific, identifiable legal events. This standard framework is anchored in what economists call de jure ownership. It assumes that actual market power follows the formal legal possession of assets, equity, and voting securities. AI markets operate under a distinct structural reality. In these ecosystems, influence is not driven by physical plants or strict shareholder voting blocks, but instead by highly fluid, intangible assets. The most valuable resources of an AI organization are its foundational models, access to massive compute infrastructure, specialized engineering direction, and proprietary data pipelines. Because these resources are dynamic, they can shift direction incrementally. A company can align its roadmap with a partner's interests over months or years, easily bypassing standard Hart-Scott-Rodino reporting thresholds. In the modern AI ecosystem, de jure legal ownership has officially collapsed as a reliable proxy for measuring actual market power. To see how this works in practice, examine the structural architecture between Microsoft and OpenAI. Microsoft does not hold formal de jure ownership over OpenAI, yet the two entities operate with deep technical and commercial alignment. The primary mechanism of leverage here is infrastructure. By provisioning massive, exclusive cloud computing resources, an upstream provider creates an environment where the downstream partner relies on them to function. This chart illustrates the control spectrum in AI, moving from formal legal boundaries on the left to the operational realities of how platforms exercise authority on the right. Starting in the green zone, legal ownership relies on contracts, equity, and formal governance. But in AI, this is merely the starting line for influence, not the finish line. Moving into the yellow zone, technical direction shows where influence actually begins to accumulate. This happens through the alignment of AI models, access to compute, and shared data pipelines. Finally, in the red zone, operational influence represents the stage where control truly solidifies. Here, dominant partners dictate deployment rules, control platform integration, and steer hiring. This diagram details 3 specific paths where this layered influence accumulates over time in the real world, contrasting them against a traditional corporate merger. Path 1 is the pre-merger alliance. Through technical collaboration and shared computing, firms create deep structural dependence well before any regulatory filing takes place. By the time the FTC evaluates a transaction, competitive influence is already locked in. Path 2 is internal organizational drift. Capital providers and commercial partners slowly exert pressure on deployment decisions and talent roadmaps. The firm's actual operational priorities drift towards its backers, even while its formal governance documents remain static. Path 3 is vertical stack dominance, where control travels up and down the supply chain. An upstream provider with a dominant foundational model can dictate terms for downstream applications. They can constrain what third-party developers build and how they deploy it, all without executing a single acquisition. Market power no longer relies on a single boardroom signing. It accrues incrementally through operational entanglement. Competition policy has faced theories of harm related to gradual technological capture before. The best historical precedent comes from the early 2000s hardware era, specifically standard-setting organizations, or SSOs. These were the industry working groups that defined universal technical rules like USB or Wi-Fi. This dynamic was tested heavily in the FTC's litigation against Rambus, a technology company participating in JEDEC, the consortium for memory chip standards. The FTC argued that Rambus actively shaped the technical standard, while intentionally failing to disclose that it held relevant patents covering those exact specifications. Once the broader industry locked into the standard, Rambus asserted its patent rights. They were perfectly positioned to extract massive royalties from the market. The FTC initially won the case, but the decision was ultimately overturned because the evidentiary burden was exceedingly high. To maintain the ruling, regulators had to prove that the industry would have adopted a different standard if Rambus hadn't interfered. Quantifying that counterfactual proved legally unworkable. This chart outlines why the current AI market departs from that legacy SSO model in ways that make the regulatory challenge exponentially harder today. Traditional SSOs operated on slow, multi-year innovation cycles. In AI, formal standard setting cannot keep pace. De facto standards are established in real time through the rapid adoption of dominant APIs. Furthermore, the legacy disputes centered entirely on patent lock-ins. Today, AI companies anchor their market power in trade secrets, proprietary data pipelines, and continuous talent acquisition, assets that are much harder to track and regulate. Modern antitrust agencies operate under a much higher state of scrutiny than the regulators of the Rambus era, but they are attempting to measure these highly fluid AI markets with the exact same rigid legal tools. The enduring lesson of Rambus is clear. When competitive harm arises from gradual technical integration rather than a discrete transaction, identifying the precise legal moment to intervene becomes an evidentiary nightmare. Traditional law optimizes for what we can physically verify. The legacy framework dictates that control strictly follows ownership, built for an industrial economy. The AI reality reverses this timeline. Influence now precedes ownership, gradually aggregating through API connections, shared infrastructure, and closed data flows. Traditional merger law is structurally insufficient to govern this level of strategic coordination and compute dependence. The final economic takeaway from contemporary disputes like the OpenAI litigation is that evaluating them purely as breach of contract claims misses the broader market reality. We require a new framework for evaluating market concentration. Regulators, economists, and legal practitioners must move past asking who owns the firm. They must instead ask who actually steers the system, and at what specific point does infrastructure dependence solidify into structural control. This theoretical framework is already triggering international regulatory actions that sidestep traditional ownership models. In our next episode, we will apply this framework to a concrete empirical example, the Meta-Manus transaction. This case involves Meta's proposed $2 billion acquisition of a leading autonomous AI agent developer. In April 2026, China's National Development and Reform Commission officially blocked the deal. The NDRC ordered the parties to withdraw the transaction specifically because the partnership had progressed too deeply into technical alignment and operational coordination. The regulatory block was enforced despite the fact that the transaction never actually crossed the threshold of a legally completed acquisition. As we will see, the Meta-Manus case proves the exact dynamic we've outlined today. De facto control can trigger aggressive antitrust enforcement long before a single share of equity officially changes hands.
Thanks for watching. For the deep dive economic analysis behind these stories, join us at econworks.com. Subscribe to stay informed on where law and economics meet the market. We'll see you in the next episode.